this an example of where there's a text with a tremendous amount of details and lots of information in order to tell what in modern language might be the big lie? Or is it just simply one looks at it and says there's really no evidence here or there, so it's a story. It's perhaps it's simply fiction, but we know that there are facts behind it. So how does it all come together with all of these details? How do you refute it if you really need to refute it at all?
That's a very good question. That's a very well put question. I would say first, the finest of lies, the finest of planned and manufactured stories always have the most banal and day-to-day detail. The idea about Hillary Clinton being at the heart of a pedophile ring, the QAnon sort of fantasy. It's about a very ordinary corner pizzeria that everybody knows about. You take your kids to. It's that tension between the plausible and implausible that's an extremely creative one. Now, you have to be good at it, but also you have to know the predisposition of your audience. That is to say, if they're willing to think that Hillary Clinton is a monster or that Jews kill children, you can build on it. And it will appeal to particular audience. Now, the most interesting thing is that we are hearing the voice in this text of the enthusiast. He wants to make this happen. He wants this boy avenged. He wants his cathedral on the map. But there were, even within his cathedral, voices of dissent. And he admits it, because ultimately he wrote this text in Latin for members of his community, for people like them. We knew that there were copies in other monasteries. There were bound to be voices of criticism against him. Who is this new guy who's invented this new cult of some sort of raggedy boy, Skinner boy we've never heard of? Okay, so it's unusual for a profile like that to become sanctified. So he has to justify it. And he either invents or maybe did encounter criticism. And he describes the sub-prior, the leader basically of their community, Elias, as being really against this whole innovation. Because it has no sanction. It hasn't come from the bishop. It hasn't come from the pope. This is not, we have no proof that this boy intended to be a martyr. There's a whole issue also of intent, just like a Judaism kavanah. How do you know this boy even, okay, maybe he was killed, but that doesn't make him a martyr. All these, then he answers them one by one. And he answers them with theological arguments, quotes, fathers of the church, who said you need to have kavanah, whatever, you don't have to have intention. And he answers them one by one, but he admits that there was pushback. Now, we also know that this cult did not really take off in a very big way. There was, in the first generation, a lot of enthusiasm from extremely modest people. Most people are villagers from villages owned or controlled by the cathedral priory. So they have connections. They hear about it from a reeve or an administrator who comes to their village to discuss the crops or to discuss the administration. They hear about this. And they have a sick kid, they have an ailment, they have a chronic complaint that won't go away. So they go to Norwich. But it never became a big cult. The offerings at the altar in the 13th century, we have some accounts in the cathedral, were not tremendous. The notoriety of the case is in the way that it traveled as a story that could be picked up in other contexts and made much of. And I always like to compare that in 1144, when the family of the boy, as it were, if we believe that happened, said Jews did this. Now, Thomas of Monmouth in 1150 cannot claim that 6 years ago there was this whole hoo-ha in Norwich without it really having happened, because everybody's around to know. So he's clearly building on some rumor and some complaint about Jews that had occurred. but he magnifies it, writes it up, and gives it narrative structure and so on. But clearly it did not have at the time. And he also connects it to an existing and long-standing complaint throughout medieval Europe about the corruption of officials. That Jews and officials are in cahoots because Jews bribe and they're corrupt. It's only the good people who can rail against it, and in this case, this monk, and expose that the Jews really deserve punishment in 1144, and it's only because of the protection of the sheriff that they did not. And added to that, the protection of the sheriff in a period of civil war, when also control of administration was much laxer. So that's the wider context.